This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
With the increased threat of mass violence, it is more important now than ever to look for means to prevent harm. Join us as we explore technologies aimed at countering gun violence, technologies designed not to just detect weapons, but to prevent harm before it strikes. Hear from Homeland Security's Don Hough, active shooter prevention expert Chris Grollneik, and Charles County Public Schools Security Director Jason Stoddard in our conversation, Preventing Harm with Gun Detection Technology. Let me introduce the panelists, really distinguished group of folks here. First, we have Jason Stoddard, who's the Director of Safety and Security at Charles County Public Schools. Jason, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ara. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. As Ara said, my name is Jason Stoddard. I'm the Director of Safety and Security for the Charles County Public Schools. We're located about 25 miles south of Washington, D.C. We have 41 schools and centers, 4,000 employees, and about 27,000 students. We were the first organization in the state of Maryland to implement a AI-driven gun detection program on our exterior cameras. So we've been doing that over the last year and have it fully implemented and operational at this point. Again, it's an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion with the distinguished experts that we have.
Absolutely. Speaking of distinguished experts, Don Hough. Don is with CISA, Department of Homeland Security. Don, would you mind just providing us a brief background and your expertise in this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And good afternoon to everyone. Don Hough with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. I serve as the Deputy Associate Director for School Safety. And so my team and I on a daily basis work with the 130,000 K-12 schools across the country, really focused in a few areas: physical security, what are the technologies, tactics, and policies that support that; cybersecurity, same thing; and then violence prevention. CISA is part of the Department of Homeland Security, and so we work on a daily basis with our partners at the Secret Service, at FEMA, at headquarters, to pull together what the DHS has to offer for K-12 schools. But the other part of our job is we serve as the administrator for schoolsafety.gov. After the tragedy on Valentine's Day of 2018 at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, there was a realization that, hey, among the federal government, there's a lot of parts of it that are focused on school safety. But if you're a school leader out there, you either need to have a lot of time or a lot of expertise to figure out where those are in the federal government. And so that really is what birthed schoolsafety.gov. It's a central point of all the resources, grant dollars, tools from across the federal government, the Departments of Education, Justice, Health and Human Services, and Homeland Security, in an easy to access, accessible platform. And so we work with those interagency partners on a daily basis to try to communicate how the federal government has to offer to support K-12 schools on their journey of safety and security.
No, that's great. Very important stuff, Don. Really appreciate it. And welcome to the conversation. And last but not least, the nation's recognized leading active shooter prevention expert, Chris Grollneik. Chris, welcome to the program. Just would you mind giving us a brief background in your interest in the topic?
Thanks, Ara. Thanks for having me. Honored to be part of ZeroNow, the advisory council, and to be with Don and Jason. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. It's an honor. So I run the Active Shooter Prevention Project. It's something that stemmed after my involvement for the attorneys and direct representation for the families of Stoneman Douglas. In 2010, I was involved in an active shooter in real time. In 2012, I wrote my master's thesis on the phenomena of active shooters. In 2012, 13, and 14, I contracted to both DHS and several other federal agencies working about run, hide, fight. And in 2018, 19, and 20, I started recognizing some things that we could be doing better. So we started something called the PRO model. I've been working with the Department of Justice this past year. It's prevention, response, and options. And there's no way one person, one organization, or even one government can do it. It's going to take all the people. So we went to the public. And in a similar effort as Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, we went to the public and said, listen, we can create safer places. So to be part of the Safer School Network with ZeroNow, truly humbling. It's an honor, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome to the program. And Jason, you mentioned in your opening comments gun detection technology, right? Visual gun detection first in Maryland. And obviously, as ZeroNow, we advocate for a holistic, multi-layered approach. And so where does gun detection fit in to a multi-layered approach, and how do you apply that in your experience at Charles County Public Schools?
So I think it's important to understand that if you don't have locking classroom doors or guided vestibules or radio systems with interoperability for your first responders, or adequate lighting or cameras that work and that are properly placed, we probably shouldn't be having a discussion about the next step of adding gun detection, whether it's through artificial intelligence on your cameras, or whether it's through weapons detection at your entry points, or whether it's through gunshot detection and audible detection as an appliance or as a standalone appliance for detecting gunshots in or around schools. We have sat back and tried to build as big of the most robust model that we can, with multiple layers that have redundancy built into them. Everything from signage to locking doors to as I said, adequate lighting, to doing camera surveys, to doing physical assessments. Once we became comfortable with where we were, we began to look for what was next. What was the threat that we could see at the current time? We began to implement a gun detection program on our exterior cameras about 2 months before the tragedy in Nashville. And when you look at the tragedy in Nashville, you see that multiple layers of what I would classify as best practices either were not there or did not work to keep the shooter out. So when we look at that, we want to see that individual shooter walked up to the front of that school or that side door with the firearms visible. And then began to shoot through the door and walk through the door. So things like safety film, things like making sure that our doors are locked, things like that there's cameras over the top of those, exterior cameras over the top of those doors. And lastly, what can we do to buy ourselves a couple seconds or some time to implement a change in operations inside the school to save lives, to either run or to lock down or to do whatever, which is where the AI detection that we've put in comes into play.
No, Chris, go ahead. Like, what role do cameras have? And I know you mentioned before that most active shooters recently started the event outside of facility.
40+% start outside. The numbers are a little bit all over the place because you can skew any statistic you want. But if you just look at the last, say, 10, it's closer to the purported number of 70. But we're just going to say for a 25-year look back, approximately 41% start outside. I'd really like to agree with Jason here. If you don't take a holistic approach to, and you just run up and say, this new latest and greatest one-off pin drop lock, like that was a large sale after Uvalde, tragically. And those of you that know me know I don't speak about school shootings very often, but I'm going to take this exception here because it's important that we don't just have fatalities, but we have something we can do about it in remembrance of. So pin drop locks are great, but if you have to remind someone to lock the door, the pin drop lock means nothing. So if we can start with something, and I've been touring the country this past year, evangelizing something called the gift of time. In that, it specifically states an active shooter starts at 0 minutes and it ends at 8 during a 25-year look back. The police don't arrive for 8 minutes. So if we go to Jason's example of, say, Nashville, the shooter was in the parking lot walking around with 2 ARs and a pistol for over 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Had that AI picked up, it would have sent in a signal inside, and maybe the overlapping and overarching messages that they had that we've put together: run, hide, fight, react, escape, survive, shelter in place, activate active shooter protocols. Maybe we could have narrowed that down into something and given more people a chance. But it starts, and it really does. Gun detection is probably the first layer in something that I'll coin the painful onion. It's not easy. It takes time and it takes commitment, and you just need to know what you're getting. But you never want to just start with, oh, look, a piece of technology, that's all I need. You actually need to layer it out.
And Don, so how does a school determine what type of gun detection technology is right for their situation, their circumstance, their physical plant?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's a question that that unfortunately I think we get asked too much, right? You have school administrators coming from a great place often after a tragedy happens and saying, okay, tell me what to buy, tell me what to do. And the truth is, when we think about how do schools pick through the decision of what technology is right for them, there just simply isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Context is key, right? If you think about the schools that you're familiar with, the litany of designs, multiple building campuses, open floor plans, so on and so forth, that vary so much. And then you layer on top of that, you're dealing with the technology that you deploy for younger kids in that K-5 environment is probably different than what you're thinking about in higher education or high school. And so even where you find a technology that fills a lot of the hole or the gap that you're trying to fill, it's always about how does that technology fit in with the other technologies that you already have in place. And some of these things, when I use the term technologies, I don't mean it in a hyper advanced way, right? It can be on the side of the scale related to AI, but it's also things like on the lower end, like locks and glazing and film, right? It's that litany of tactics, tools, technologies that are designed to detect, deter, and delay. And so some of that context, while I can't tell a school, here's the technology to go get, here's some of the things that I ask them to think through when they're trying to make a decision about, do I invest in technology A or technology B? First is, what's the layout and need of your physical campus, right? Second is, what are your state and local jurisdiction requirements? And they vary quite a bit across the country. Are you in an area where law enforcement can respond quickly, or are you in a more rural area where we're looking upwards of 15 or 20 minutes before a law enforcement officer gets there? Do you have armed security on your campus or SROs? Do you have good two-way communication and panic buttons between your classrooms and your office or main communication center? All that starts to paint a picture of what I'd consider kind of the context and the maturity of your school's security system. And those type of questions help determine, okay, here's what makes sense for the next piece of technology for you that would help move your school down that maturity path of continual improvement on the security front. I often find schools in this space, while they might have money for the short-term implementation to buy the technology or the next step, they often need to think through, okay, what's this look like a year from now? Do we have money to sustain it, right? Or do we have staff to sustain it? Are we going to be able to patch, update, replace when inevitably that technology wears out or fails? And so these are some of the contexts that I think really drive the decision-making around what technology is right for your school.
With that, Jason, so Don mentioned the different types of schools and urban, rural, and the unique situations that they're in. When it came to your decision at Charles County Public Schools, how did you determine which technology to go with? And somebody asked a question here, why you opted to go with visual gun detection versus gunshot detection. How did you make that decision? What did that process look like?
So I think the first place to start with that question is really at the end, is what is the limits to the type of specific solution that you're implementing. When we look at that, we see that for visual gun detection, we're looking to expand our ability to detect a threat out as far as humanly possible. And that's predominantly what its purpose is. When we look at gunshot technology or gunshot detection technology that's been around for several decades, whether it's through, Shot Spotter or through some of the other organizations now that you can put it as an appliance on your internal cameras, that is post bad things happening. So you look at that you look at the shooting being at the 0 minute, when shots are being fired, we're already behind the 8 ball. And then when you look at weapons detection within inside of the school as a physical entry point, you've got to understand, as Don said, the amount of different things that go into and the expansion and escalation of commitment that you have to a lot of different logistical and personnel issues with all of these solutions. And by far, adding weapons detection at entry points requires far more logistics, far more human capital. And as it sits today, in most scenarios, it's going to require a lot more cash and a lot more cash flow in order to fund those things. So when you sit down and you look at all the limitations, what can you afford? What can you continue to afford in maintenance of effort? And what exactly are you trying to do? Our organization uses the 5 Ds. I am very much in looking for ways to deter issues. I'm very much into looking for ways to be able to detect the threats as fast as absolutely possible, and then delay anybody getting into our castle. Those are the real big 3 things that we look for, that we're trying to build that redundancy for within inside of our school system.
And that's an important point. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to jump on there with exactly what Don and Jason just said. Specifically, I just want to piggyback quickly on 3 specific items. Number 1 is, if the shooting starts at 0 and we could get a 3-minute advance notice, or 2 minutes, and I think it was 2 minutes and 46 seconds in Nashville prior to a shot even being fired, and you can implement your Jason's term, castle defense plan, if you will. That means you've taken the time and you have a good assessment done. You know what technologies you have. And the key thing here I would put, and I don't do anything over fear. It's all about preparedness. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of people around the country, and I think Don would agree with this, because I've talked to a lot of people at DHS about this and the Secret Service. And that's what they think. They have a policeman in place, everything's okay. They have an SRO in place, everything's okay. Well, that may be true and it may not be true. Now, if we do a look back at the last 8 massive school shootings, active shooters, or mass casualty events, you can use any one of those 3 definitions. There were armed officers on scene and did not intervene. That includes Nashville. They were armed teachers, 2 of them. So it's not that they failed to, it's that maybe they weren't either A, prepared, it's willingness over ability, right? I want to be an inside linebacker. It doesn't mean I have the ability to be. That's number 1. And then number 2, did we equip them with that outside gun detection? Jason said it out as far as humanly possible. Well, that technology is a scientific achievement. And here we implement that. We now see something before the human can. We alert the human and we tell them, hey, this is where it's coming from. This is where the threat exists, and then move people away from there. And I think that's going to give you, so out of that 8 minutes, you have 3 minutes back. But it's also important to understand, no matter where you are, like Don said, either you have police on scene or they're 14, 15 minutes away. It takes a human being 5 minutes to call police during an active shooter. It's just a historic fact. The Secret Service report says it takes 1 minute, and that's true, to get in touch with dispatch. But it takes 4 minutes for you to recognize that there are shots fired and for you to talk yourself into making the phone call. Gun detection software and gunshot detection software, doesn't matter what spectrum you're on, it doesn't discriminate. It says, this is A, what do you want to do? And it helps speed up that decision. And that's that gift of time back. Thank you.
Chris and Jason, Don, that you sparked a thought. And Chris, we've talked about this so many times, about the concept. We talk about ZeroNow, it's about zero harm, right? And it starts before the event, right? How do we prevent an event from happening? And this is that we're not talking about leakage and preventative measures on that respect. On this particular conversation, we have done in the past, but certainly that's a factor here. But can we prevent an event from happening by providing that early intervention, by dismantling a situation before it gets to the point where an individual is going to execute a act of mass violence at a school? But Steve mentioned it in the comments here. You're absolutely right, Steve. And so if we fail to prevent an event, can we prevent harm through early detection, right? Early detection of a threat, and then automating response, like you mentioned, Chris, that gifted time, notifying first responders, law enforcement, notifying people in the building, locking the doors, that whole automation side of things. So If we can't prevent an event, if we fail at that, then can we mitigate the scope of harm through automating and early detection? So that's an important factor that I think that we need to do. Hey, Don, so where does research on gun detection systems tell us about the efficacy of their use? What have we learned so far? Because I know your organization has done some research on this, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks so much. And that's right. Part of the role of the federal government in this space is to take on research that either the private sector it isn't in their best interest to take on, or that the government's uniquely positioned to do. And so we spend quite a bit working with research partners to understand the phenomenon of targeted violence, in particular active shooter. I'll talk a little bit about some of that research, and I would just caveat that, as with any research study taken on its own, I think Chris said it well earlier, you can skew statistics, but cumulatively, I'll share some of the findings. So as part of our mission at CISA to promote safe and secure schools across the nation, we recently sponsored a school security simulation experiment, or what we call a SIMX, in partnership with the MITRE Corporation and George Mason University. It was a 2-week-long study focused on examining security technologies in the K-12 environment in a virtual setting. And so we produced data-informed recommendations to help us understand what's the efficacy of both physical and operational security measures. So we had hundreds of college students from George Mason participate in a virtual environment of scenario after scenario, reacting based on their school training to an active shooter. And in some of those scenarios, we ascribed the active shooter a motive, right? Maybe they were retaliating for a grievance and looking for a specific person, right? In some cases, maybe they were looking to target a mass attack and reach the highest body count. And so we took a look at that and said, well, what's happening here that is more saves lives or deters death. So we looked at it in 3 factors, right? The first was, is a presence of an SRO in the school or not? Does it have a significant impact on the number of deaths from an active shooter situation? 2, if the schools with different door locking policies, whether classroom doors are always locked or if they get locked when a shooting starts. And then what the school's notification policy was, right? If the notifications were decentralized, if teachers could essentially cause a lockdown, or if they were centralized and had to be issued from the central office. So you can find the findings in full analysis of this SIMX scenario available on CISA.gov. But some of the conclusions that we found are certainly in these scenarios, the presence of an SRO had a significant impact on the outcome of active shooter events. Students were able to get out of the school more safely into lockdown classrooms with fewer casualties versus the virtual scenarios we did with no SRO in the school. Specific to taking a look at the technology around classroom locks, classroom doors that locked without the intervention of a teacher or school staff, so as in they were pre-locked doors, more classrooms were able to reach the lockdown procedure and get students outside safely. And then finally, taking a look at the notification end of it, allowing teachers to give lockdown notifications over, for example, the PA system or another decentralized mode did not have a significant impact on the outcomes of death or casualties in these experiments. Again, I caveat these just to talk about it. But I share that because I know this group is committed to understanding the root cause of school violence. And so these type of research findings, part of the broader mix of things that make up our insights and best practices. Right now, finally, we're working on a large-scale research project in a computer-based scenario with the Lincoln National Lab at MIT, looking at similar things, at active shooter scenarios taking place and modeling them in a K-12 environment, again, to test out different technologies gun detection, glazing, locks, and those type of things. And those results will be published in early 2024 from that study as well on CISA.gov. So there's a few places there to access some of that top line research coming out from the government.
Thanks, Don. Jason.
One of the things that I think we need to make sure that we're being very clear about is as we decide which one of these technologies that we are putting into place, and this kind of goes back to the last question that you asked me, we need to look at what type of events that we're trying to prevent or reduce. We have spoken a lot about the traditional active shooter, active assailant type events. However, I think I would hope that we can all agree that keeping politics out of this discussion is much needed. And we have seen a drastic reduction in the amount of active shooter mass violence type attacks since prior to 1999 over the last number of years in a K-12 space because of the work that we are all doing, our colleagues are doing, our mental health professionals that we have in the schools are doing, and things like that. However, what we have seen a drastic increase in since at least 2017 is the leakage of community gun violence into our schools. I think prior to 2017, we can all say that we can all agree that schools were in many cases were seen as being safe havens, even in areas that have been plagued with gun violence for generations. But that has subsequently changed. So when we're looking at the different technologies, trying to determine what the largest threat level is for your individual area would be an appropriate stance to figure out which one of these technologies would be best to implement in which order. They're all likely to be, if you can implement them, if you had unlimited funds to implement them all would be wonderful, but you may have to pick which one or two you're going to implement. In our location, we are very lucky with the amount of police resources that we have. We are very lucky with this speed at which we can get most police officers and an initial response to most of our schools. We have not seen what other school districts have seen to the same extent with the leakage of community gun violence, but we have recovered a number of weapons within inside of our schools and a couple handguns, but nothing where there's been a shot fired. So our stance where we were was to look at taking the forensic cameras that we have and turning them into a proactive resource to combat the specific idea of what we saw at the tragedy at Nashville. Now, if my school system was in a different location, even in the state of Maryland, I may be more seriously looking at that leakage of community gun violence, which that's going to take me in the direction of potentially inputting the AI-driven weapons detection at my entry points. So we have to understand the threat. You have to understand the gap analysis and what you're looking at in order to determine which one of these technologies that you implement, at least initially.
So, Jason, when you're talking about the AI technology or entry points, you're talking about concealed weapons detection?
Yes. However, with any security strategy, there's limitations. There are plenty of detractors out there for placing of metal detectors, traditional metal detectors, or artificial intelligence-driven weapons detection systems. That's probably could be a whole nother webinar amongst itself. But there's limitations for everything. What I would say, my research would indicate, and all the things that I've read about whether it's regular metal detectors or more specifically the artificial intelligence-driven weapons detection systems, they are really, really good at finding guns. Likely beyond that, there's probably going to be a reduction in the amount of weapons that you're going to find because of the way that you have the settings on those. But there's also ancillary effects that go, how long are your lines? What's your percentage of secondary searches? How long are your kids waiting to get into school, and how many times are they late because of that? In our school system, we have almost every one of our schools has exterior trailers or educational cottages. So it's especially at the secondary level, every day, those doors are 7 or 8 times. There's kids going outside to inside. So how are you going to scan all of those? I view the AI-driven weapons detection as a 70% solution. And it has to be discussed in that manner with your public, not as this is the panacea that's going to keep all of our babies safe, because it's just simply not the truth.
And go ahead, Chris.
I was going to tag on to that. I totally agree with that. And I think that we have to prepare the end user that is preparing their visitors, customers, guests, and essentially clients, the kids and the families, that you have to shift the paradigm from we cannot respond our way out of this, right? If the shot fires, it's too late. So I saw a couple comments in the chat about left of bang, and that's absolutely right. And exactly like Don said, but specifically what Jason just said about 70% for artificial intelligence. There are some great studies out there about metal detectors vis-a-vis weapons detection technology. And weapons, I would liken it really, to bring it down to a very simplistic statement. It would be like yesterday, weapons detection through metal detectors were okay. They weren't good. They were okay. And they caused long lines. When what if becomes what now, similar than happened early this year, 2 teachers were killed because somebody walked through with a gun. The detector went off. They said, what was the detection? And the 18-year-old pulled out a gun and shot them both and said, well, it's my gun. But, it's making it a little bit crass, but that's exactly what happened. And then I believe the technology side of it is making it a little bit easier it's more palatable, if you will, that we can understand, okay, something's happening, and it gives us that heads up virtually. And the way that we're training our brains now with our phone in our pocket and everybody's got Google at their fingertips, now you can understand what you're being notified of. And to close that gap, I think it's just going to take some education and some real hard conversations with the communities that say, this is here, right? And I'm not saying an active shooter. Let's talk about what Don said. It's the whole gamut from left to right. Violence, active assailant, active shooter, gang violence, spillage, leakage, whatever. If we address this and we start at somewhere in the middle, and we don't go overly cautious and fearful and say everyone needs a lock and we're having 50 new armed guards, and we just start something that's reasonable, you can start exactly where Jason did. And that's, assessing what's out there, what's available, using Don's resources, and then putting them into action.
Jason, just going back to you real quickly. So talking about your implementation, do you have the gun detection technology on all of your cameras throughout every single school and hallways and entryways? I mean, what is your strategy, and has that been an issue?
So the way that we ended up implementing the program was on exterior cameras only. And at first I had some concerns with that. This came from our attorney. Our attorney has a very conservative view of what the FERPA protections are. And in his view, that the taking of any type of video and sharing it with an external source could result in a FERPA violation. That may or may not be the same interpretation of FERPA across the United States, but that is the one that I have to, that pays my salary. So I have to abide by what he says. So when it came to that, as we implemented it and as we walked through the process, and it is a process to implement any type of this technology, as we did that, what we discovered was the placing of it on an external camera, unbeknownst to us, is probably going to be the best way to do it, because we are really concentrating on the idea of detecting a threat as far away as we can. If we put it, from my opinion, if you put weapons detection, artificial intelligence driven weapons detection that rides on a camera inside of a building, a school, or something like that, when it activates inside of the school, you are to the right of bang, and that's not where we want to be. So from my point of view, from the experiences that I've had, the research that I've done, I believe that concentrating on the exterior cameras, which led us down a whole nother rabbit hole of implementation. I wrote an article for Campus Safety Magazine as one of their sponsors to this program on our experience with implementation of this. And there's a lot of considerations that need to go into what you're putting into your camera system for it to work effectively. What I can tell you is the artificial intelligence driven camera technology works. It works as advertised. However, there's a lot of variables that go into it. The height of the cameras, the reason that cameras are placed where. We found a tremendous amount of cameras that were placed on dumpsters. That sounds odd. However, we have a problem, or have had a problem for decades, with illegal trash dumping, which costs us a tremendous amount of money to clean up. So what do? We put cameras there. And that's not a good place to place a license for a gun detection on that camera. So there's a lot that goes into that implementation and determining what you're going to put out, which one of these solutions you're going to look at.
And by the way, for our participants, Jason's article on campus safety will be available after this webinar in the ZeroNow community under key takeaways. In fact, after we're done, we have a lot of questions coming in. We have a lot of questions coming before. Whatever we don't get to today during the live program, immediately following this, you go to the ZeroNow community, just go to zeronow.org, click on community. Jason and Chris and Don will be available to answer questions in written form in the community. Jason, you brought up a key point. I just returned from a trip to Scotland and couldn't help but notice all the castles, the old castles with the watchtowers at every single corner, looking for a perpetrator watching their way. And one of the conversations we always have is creating this invisible fortress, right? Having somebody watching 24/7 for someone that should not be there with a weapon that should not be in their possession. And so the concept of building an invisible fortress is something that really resonated when I was just across the sea. Now, Don, so someone just, and I know, I think I'd love to get all three of your perspectives on this, but Oscar asks about Uvalde. The shooter started shooting from outside the school. What is the effective range of these AI detection systems? So if there was an AI detection system outside of Uvalde, do you think that would have made a difference in that specific case? Obviously, we can't predict the past, but any perspective on that, Don?
Yeah, I think Uvalde serves as yet another watershed moment for us to learn from, right? There were multiple failures in that situation that many of the tactics we're discussing today would have prevented. And I'll leave it to my co-presenters here to talk about distance. They would know better than me on some of the latest AI camera tech. What I would offer, though, whether it's Uvalde, but zooming out more broadly, is when we think about physical security measures for school, it has to come in the context of a layered physical security system. So when the schools the schools that I visit that have the best physical security systems aren't relying on a single tactic or technology such as cameras or locks, or they have a set of technologies and processes at different levels of their school, right? So what you put at the street level, maybe not as active, right? But is it fencing? Is it landscaping? How do you control traffic and access to that part of your property? When you're in the parking lot, are we thinking about motion activated lights? Are we thinking about cameras there? Are we thinking about safety patrol? And each of those levels down to the monitoring of what's happening in the hallways and the classrooms inside the building requires a set of technology tactics that work together. And so one resource that I would point folks to think through this process of how can we build or strengthen our layered physical security approach is CISA's K-12 School Security Guide. So the guide itself talks about that doctrine and methodology about how do you get your physical security tactics to work together and overlap. If you think of it like a pile of Swiss cheese, right? It's stacking a bunch of tactics on top of each other. Each has a gap in them, but if you put enough together, the chance for a single point of failure is diminished. The most important part about the CISA's K-12 School Security Guide, though, that I'd point you to is the school safety assessment tool that's with it. And what that does is takes a look at about 400 different school physical security scenarios or situations, excuse me. And you can put some information in about your school, right? Where you're located, some of your context. And then you can pick a scenario and say, from low consequence things like an unauthorized adult picks up a young person at dismissal time to a high consequence incident like an active shooter incident. And then you can put in, here's the physical security measures that we have that we would expect to kick in this scenario if this was real life at our school. And then I'll ask you, how confident are you in those? Because we all know if you've worked in a school that just because you have a locking policy, that's great, but is it rigorously followed, or is that door propped open half the time out to the teacher's parking lot, right? And then it'll take those results, what your tactics are, how confident you are that those tactics are gonna be adhered to, and the scenario you're looking at in the context of your school, and compare it against 400 other school safety physical security, and say, this is where we would anticipate in your layers of Swiss cheese and your layered security that you're going to have your first point of failure. And here's the resources, chapter and verse that we point you to if you're trying to plug that hole. And here's the federal grant dollars that are available that you can apply for to purchase some of that technology. And so that's accessible, is all part of free of charge, paid for by the American taxpayer, and is written all in a way that is accessible to a non-security professional, so designed so that a teacher, a principal could complete this. And then you move up from there. You engage more experts from your security departments, you bring in outside consultants, so on and so forth. But that's a great starting place to say, how do you integrate these? Let me turn it over to my panelists to talk more about the camera distance.
To answer the question specifically, it depends. When it gets down to, because you have to look at, once you get into this, the gun detection technology that rides on your cameras, looking at things such as the dual streaming capabilities of your cameras, how old are your cameras, whether they are have an open infrastructure that allows the weapons detection system, the company, to actually operate onto your cameras, the pixels per square inch, your field of view, all of that will come into play. And then you start after that talking about environment, shadows, sun angles, tree cover, shade, ambient light. Things that all of those things reduce the effectiveness of these programs. The sun angle, whether it's clear, whether it's not, whether somebody's moving from the sun into an awning or from the shade into the sun, all of those things can have a drastic impact on the length of detection from the camera point. Additionally, how high is the camera? Some cameras that are 40 feet off the ground, you're going to get 10 feet from the camera if you're looking down on it. We found that cameras that are 6 to 10 feet off the ground, placed directly over the top of entry points, provided us with 20 to 30 feet on with all the environmental conditions, meeting an ideal standard, 20 to 30 feet of detection out from that camera. However, thinking outside the box, you look at situations such as Uvalde, you look at situations in other locations, and somebody mentioned something about hospitals or, and I can't remember exactly where they were talking about, but if you're placing cameras 6 to 10 feet off the ground in parking lots that are also feeding in, that detection can be, this licenses can be placed onto those cameras as well. So again, you're expanding that ability to detect that threat. So don't just look at cameras that are assigned or attached to your physical plant themselves. There can be cameras that are on the exterior that you're utilizing this as well to expand that detection capability.
Chris, I know that you very actively study, school shooting incidents and are aware. I mean, let's look at Uvalde, just to kind of follow up on that question. I mean, do you think that the technology, if they had gun detection automation, would that have made a difference in that case, or even in Nashville? I mean, from your perspective, I mean, would that have made a difference, or is it, was that just something that was not preventable?
I'm going to take the hard pass on Uvalde. Only because the number of things that went wrong were exceptional, and it would be very difficult or challenging, or maybe even disingenuous to hypothesize of what happened. But Nashville is pretty crystal clear, and there's going to be some facts that are coming out. Not that I know something that you don't know type thing, but there will be some facts, mitigating factors that are going to come out tragically. Training between staff, training between students, training between families, training between teachers, and training between the community. Some large gaps there, and that'll be pretty prevalent here in a couple months, I think. However, on the gun detection, sure, in that parking lot, and even assigning Jason's principles and philosophies to, or his best practices that they've put in, and the different cameras that you can insert that technology into, 100%, because you have weapons visible for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I just want to take this minute to go back and just forewarn all the guests. I mean, I've read a lot of the comments in the sections, and they're great feedback, and it's a lot of good ideas, but I would just caution everyone, beware of the good idea fairy, because they're everywhere. And everyone says this idea is better than that idea. And, gunshot and gun detection, two different things. They're not all the same. And the reason they're not all the same is they all have been built to do different things. So the things to take into account: how much is your spend? What's your carryover? How much investment are you going to need after tomorrow? more than a tactical decision, but a strategic decision for spending and an allocation program. And then what problem are you trying to solve? And do you have a problem that you need to solve? And can you reallocate those resources somewhere else? And if you understand that there's going to be some issues and learning curves, what's your communication strategy for that? You know, the thing that we haven't talked about, I know I have about 1 minute, is the swatting and the limited ability to notify people in, meaning parents specifically, K through 12, because I think higher education is much further down the road than the K through 12 is in this country right now. And when swatting happens, everyone gets excited. The parents don't, you know, they want to communicate with their family. We're seeing something, you know, I'm a retired policeman. We're seeing something called the Uvalde effect, where the parents aren't listening. They're going right in the school if it's locked or not, because they want their children. Well, if there's no threat, you can maybe limit down on, listen, no gun's been detected. And then if you have gunshot, no gunshot has been detected. So we have about a 99.9% chance there is no active shooter and it is a false alarm. But still, you take proper, you know, procedures and protocols. But to get there, you have to really dive in and look at the problem you're trying to solve. And if you have a solution, make sure it's going to fix what you're actually targeting, because there's a lot of good ideas out there. That's all I'll forewarn everybody with.
There is. And Chris, and you know this, you know, with ZeroNow, we always advocate to start with an assessment, right? A gap assessment, understanding what your vulnerabilities are, you know, and, you know, rather than just going out and buying the latest and greatest technology and hodgepodge and try to make things work. Start with an assessment. Understand, where do you need to be focused? Like Don mentioned and Jason mentioned that, you know, every school environment is different. So where are your specific vulnerabilities? What do you think about that, Don?
Yeah, I think that's right on. And one of the services that we have available here at the Department of Homeland Security, again, free of charge, is across the country. We have more than 150 protective security advisors, which are physical security experts that live in communities around the country. And particularly for those schools that don't have the resources of, it's not a level playing field out there, unfortunately, right? That are struggling to take on those assessments, or maybe you do have some security experts on your team, but too often, right, leadership is trying to balance those decisions with others, and they seem to always be kind of going to the well to ask for, hey, we need this, we need that, right? And inevitably, human nature gets drowned out. What the CISA Protective Security Advisors can do, again, you can request the one in your neighborhood, in your community on CISA.gov, is they can come out, they have a consultative mission, right? None of it is required, none of it is mandated, regulated. But they come out, they'll complete an assessment with you, or they'll sit down, talk with you, help you think through, okay, I'm trying to make a decision, right? I have all these good ideas. What's the right next step? And so that's what they're there for. The Protective Security Advisor Program, they help schools, houses of worship, mass gathering places. They also, though, can really help bolster, if you do have some people that are trying to encourage leadership to take some steps and are drowned out, like we talked about. Sometimes just hearing it with an impartial third-party voice can be really helpful, and that's all available at no cost to get on their schedule, have them come out, have a conversation. And if nothing else, they'll leave you with a summary report with options for consideration to say, hey, given your context, here's some things, and where you're at today on that maturity process of safety and security, here's some things we'd really encourage you to work on.
Don, just to follow up on that. So funding. So you mentioned that, you know, obviously all school districts are not the same. Different school districts have different funding mechanisms. I mean, what is the best way to find and apply for funding for gun detection technologies? Are there federal funds that are available for this if a school district does not have the funding locally? Yeah,
there sure are, right? And right now, as opposed to any point in our nation's history, with the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act last year, those funding programs are funded at the highest level that they have been. So whether you're looking for technology, staffing, early intervention programs, diversion, the range of those things, I'd say that the best place to go look and find grant funding specific to the K-12 community is on schoolsafety.gov. There you're going to find a grant finder tool that pulls together across the entire federal government all the grant programs that are specifically designed for K-12. If you know what you're doing with grants, great. You can kind of pick and sort through there like a library. But if you're an individual that doesn't have a ton of background around grants, or that's an other duty as assigned, there's some decision tools in there that'll help you to say, this is the kind of school I am. I'm private and rural and trying to do this thing. And it will hone down, these are the programs, grant programs to take a look at. Or I'm a public school in a suburban environment with this many students and I need to do this, right? It's a great place to check that out. Also, because we know, and here in 10 days or so, maybe this will be a reality, that government funding can be a little inconsistent from the time of the year. You can also sign up for push alerts on there. So when a grant program that you're interested in, when its funding window is going to open, you get a push notification to say, hey, this program you're interested in, it's opening up. The final part I'll say about that I think is particularly helpful for the K-12 community is some grants require schools to partner with another organization. Maybe they're county, maybe they're city, maybe they're state, right? 60% of school safety funding actually can't be applied for directly by schools. You have to partner with a local or state government agency to do that. And not all some grant programs, maybe a few of them you can write in a day or half a day, but most take a good amount of time to prepare that application for. And so what you'll find there in that grant finding tool is, what's the entity in your jurisdiction that you need to partner with if it's required to access these funds? And what sort of time does it take for other K-12 schools to fill out that application so you can be as competitive as possible for those grant dollars?
Don, just a quick, we had a bunch of questions come in right away during that last comment. Are there grants available for higher education as well, or is this strictly K through 12? Are you aware of anything that's available for higher ed?
There are some that are available for higher ed, but on schoolsafe.gov, you're going to find that K-12 cut. If you're looking for higher ed options, I would encourage you to visit grants.gov, which is going to show you all the grant programs. Certainly within some of the K-12 grant programs overlap, but generally they're confined to K-12.
And just a note, so we have a number of ZeroNow partners and members that can help with grants. So if you have questions about that, even in the community, you can post a question in there. So there are some folks within the community that can also help, in addition to the resources that Don mentioned, that they're also very familiar with that too, to help you with that process. Mr. Stoddard had some thoughts there.
Yeah, as you're talking about funding, just never forget the idea of the continued escalation to what you're going to find that you need to add, or additionally, human capital that you're going to need to add to monitor. If you look at our system, there are 2 of us in our entire system that do quote unquote school security. And now I've added 300 licenses to our schools to maintain and to track and to make sure that they're operational, because we all know technology works usually until exactly the point in time in which we need it. So you have to be preventative. You have to have a maintenance plan. You have to be on top of that. The other thing to think about is how are you going to continue to fund this after the initial money that you throw at it? For example, one company that offers an artificial intelligence driven solution, it's about $100,000 per piece of equipment that is a 4-year lease. Well, after that 4 years is over, how are you going to fund it? Because once your community gets used to it, it's going to be almost impossible to take it away. And that PR nightmare that's going to come from that is something that you have to work into your plan as well.
Definitely. And unfortunately, we're running out of time here. And there are a lot of questions that came in online, that came in via the web. So thank you, Mary, for posting this. So we're going to just get some final thoughts here from our panelists before we wrap things up. But just to remind you, go to the ZeroNow community, and we'll follow up with those questions online and asynchronously in the forum. And also, like I said, if you need assistance with grants and so that, post a question there. Someone will help you with that, one of the members. So Chris Grollneik, just some final thoughts, words of wisdom for our participants as we wrap up this discussion, because there's a lot to take in and to think about.
I would say that obviously money drives the decisions, and money follows attention. And when these things happen, the attention heightens. To get the participants' views, I highly encourage them to look up school shootings and the different media promotion of different shootings and understand what they are. Some of them are just accidental or negligent discharges inside a school. Some of them are drive-by shootings outside a football game. Some, and there are the traditional massive shootings, active shooters. We do need to be prepared for them, but I don't think we need to be overly scared about them. We just need to take proper steps, start from zero, grow to a place where you are comfortable, specifically what Jason said, that you can afford it because once it's there, it's going to be hard to take away. And I'll just, many props to the Secret Service, because this is the best analogy I use. Two things. One, if you think the price of any of this is expensive, wait till you get the bill for doing nothing. And part two to that is, U.S. taxpayer, the White House, the largest target in the world, and yet the front door is open for tours. So you can layer a security system and make it not castle-like, but open, inviting, by being more secure than the one right next door that looks like a prison. So good luck to you all. And if anybody has any questions or whatever, feel free to reach out via Mary or whomever. And I might be a little slow to respond, but I'll get back to you.
Thanks, Chris. No, appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Don, final thoughts or words of wisdom for our participants today?
Ara, thank you for the invitation today and the work that ZeroNow is doing. The last piece I'd leave you with, if your school is focused on technology implementation or different tactics in sort of an episodic way, really encourage you that you have to shift the paradigm. School safety is a journey, it's a marathon, and small steps on a daily basis, attention to it every single day as a community and bringing your leadership to that is the path that the schools are having the most success. If you're only implementing after an incident happens or in reaction to something, that might be missing the mark. And so just encourage you to take steps each day and make it part of your school culture.
Thank you, Don. Appreciate it. Mr. Stoddard, final thoughts and words of wisdom.
Thank you again for the opportunity. My door is always open. I'm more than happy. I think one of the things that we need to do more of is, as a group, is share our collective experiences, especially when we're implementing different solutions and things like that. What worked, what didn't work. That's why I think writing those articles and doing those things is highly important. I'll leave everybody with a couple things. Number one, holistic approach with the redundancies, and having an all hazard approach. And that all hazard approach goes straight to mastering the fundamentals. I'm huge on broken windows, even though it's not couth in a lot of different things, but it is the truth about the world, and the idea that if we take care of the small stuff, the big stuff tends to disappear. So if we take care of the smaller things, such as making sure that nobody tailgates through the doors, if we make sure that we have all those basic best practices in place that really don't cost that much money to implement at all. And as we build upon the idea of putting technology into place, understand there is nothing that we will ever replace the three fundamentals of school safety and security with. Those three fundamentals being well-trained staff and student body, positive cultures and climates, and strong relationships between the staff and student body. We know that those three things are what keep us safe. Those three things are free, and they are well proven. And the technology or any other things that we add to that should maximize those three things. We're never taking away from it. So again, thank you for the opportunity to sit with this distinguished panel, and I appreciate it and look forward to any additional conversations that people would like to have.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Don. And we hope our goal is to make this organization obsolete, right? If we get to that point where we don't have to deal with mass violence and violence in schools by focusing on those things before things happen. And it's a cultural thing that we have to start from the very very rudimentary levels. I just want to remind people, our next conversation is collaborating for school emergency response. Our panelists will be Jeff Kelly from Mutual Link, Robert Muick from Montgomery College Public Safety Health, and Kirk Arthur from Microsoft, former Secret Service, will be discussing collaborating in emergency response. So that will be next month. You register online. It's October 17th at 2 p.m. Same place. We'll see you there. Be sure to go to the community, follow up on the conversations. Thank you very much, Chris Grollneik, Jason Stoddard, and Don Hough. Really appreciate it. We'll talk to you guys soon. Stay safe, everybody.